This is a download from the BBC. To find out more and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk. Hello. What does the new Director General of the BBC really care about? His salary? His BBC pension pot? The prospect of a knighthood? Shame on you for being so cynical. It's not about him, it's about you. Oh, that's what he told John Humphreys on Wednesday's Today programme.
The audience, and in the end that's what I'm really interested in.
The audience? Well, George, if it's the audience you're interested in, we've got plenty of them lining up in this week's programme to tell you what they're interested in.
I really wanted just to put in a serious request that you do something about the patent imbalance of reporting from, by, about women.
More of your messages for the DG later. Also in this week's programme, just some of the Noah's flood of correspondence we've had about whether Thought for the Day should be opened up to non-religious presenters.
There's a very high level of intolerance from the secular lobby that's developing that's almost as fundamental as those with faith are accused of being.
And we exclusively reveal what's happened to that much-loved canine of the airwaves, Tony Blackburn's faithful dog, Arnold. But first, what was the biggest, most important story on BBC Radio last Friday?
It's 8 o'clock on Friday the 14th of September. The headlines. A French magazine has published pictures of the Duchess of Cambridge sunbathing topless while on holiday.
The World at One. This is Sean Lay with 45 minutes of news and comment. The publication of topless pictures of the Duchess
and Duchess of Cambridge are said to be furious.
The Duke and Duchess of Cambridge have begun legal action.
The Duchess of Cambridge, topless.
And, of course, the topless story continued to top the bulletins over the weekend and into the following week. Many of you were far from impressed with BBC News' priorities.
My name is Andrew Anderson, and I want the BBC to report serious news. When its main report to millions of people is really tabloid tittle-tattle, it helps turn a minor subject into a major scandal. In making this the main, most vital subject in its news, the BBC shows itself as really no better than the magazine that publishes it.
Hi, my name is Julia Radcliffe. The significance and seriousness of the mob violence aimed at the embassies across the Middle East was already established by the time the story broke about the royals' privacy being breached. Then Camp Bastion came under attack, and these stories, the embassies and Camp Bastion, impact on many thousands of people across the world and in the UK. The royal sunbathing story is important and is clearly topical in relation to the Leveson inquiry, but by comparison it directly affects or impacts on so few people. I would really appreciate knowing more about how these decisions are made as to how a story is prioritised.
Mary Hockaday is the head of the BBC's multimedia newsroom. I asked her whether the topless Duchess was really a story of major importance.
Well, I, first of all, wouldn't actually describe the story in that way. I'm not so much interested in her and her physique. What we were interested in was what the story told us about the media, and then, very, very importantly, what it told us about the royal family and William and Kate in particular, and how they are choosing to tackle this and respond to this. And they have responded in a very different way to some of the rest of the royal family. So that was the main reason that it was, in our view, an important story.
But what did it tell us about the press? There could be no doubt that if something like that occurs, some publication in Europe will publish the pictures. I mean, you're not astonished or surprised by that. It's hardly news, is it?
What was interesting, actually, was the reaction in Britain and the British papers, and the way immediately and very firmly across the board they indicated that they weren't going to. And the discussion point there was that a shift in reaction in the context of their sense of public opinion and, of course, the Leveson inquiry?
Well, let's accept, for the point of argument, it's an important story. But an important story for how long? Because Julia Radcliffe points out that you were running it. Friday continued through the weekend. In fact, it's hardly stopped. Did you need to run it so prominently, so frequently?
She asks an interesting question about how we make judgments about stories, and in particular what we lead on and when we lead on. And we're juggling all the time the new, the important, the interesting. There were moments with that story where we felt that We were reacting to an important new development that for a while made that the top story. But I would point all the listeners to a sense that across those few days we gave really good coverage and sufficient prominence, of course, to all the other very important things going on.
Andrew Anderson suggests that there's a risk that by covering the story in the way you do, you've helped to turn a minor subject, he says, into a major scandal. The very fact that the BBC does it, and the BBC continues to cover it, as it were, legitimises other coverage and guarantees that there's even more coverage elsewhere. You set an example in this case, he thinks the wrong example.
Well, let's be very clear. We were not, on any of our output, showing the pictures. What we were doing on television, web and of course on radio was reporting and reacting to real things that were really happening, notably the reaction of the royal family. It's extremely unusual for any member of the royal family to pursue through the courts a photographer or a media organisation, and we've watched that happening in Paris. So there were real things happening that are significant news.
And at any point, did you consider running the photographs on the BBC News website?
No.
Perhaps?
No.
No?
No.
Now, Peter Colville is just one of many listeners who point out that there was hardly a shortage of news elsewhere while this is going on. And, of course, the murder of perhaps the assassination of the US envoy in Libya. This surely should be not just in the same bulletin, not just in the same headlines, but leading the headlines.
Well, the story about the photographs was not the lead in all the bulletins or all the programmes across Friday and the weekend.
No, but it led many of them.
It did lead some of them, but so did the attacks in Benghazi, so did the demonstrations against the anti-Islam video across the Middle East.
But here we're talking about far more people being affected, aren't we? I mean, in a real sense, around the world. People's lives being affected.
Which is why across that weekend, and indeed across the many, many weeks before and the weeks after, we give extensive coverage to what's happening in the Middle East and the Arab world, and we are often leading on elements of that story. Nobody in BBC News underestimates the importance of those events. But there were moments through that weekend where the newness, and for all the reasons I've given, the significance for a while of the story about Kate and William rose to the top for a while. But as I say, the editors know their audiences very well, care about them very much, are very interested in this kind of debate because, of course, there are different views sometimes among audiences about stories that people are particularly interested in or not interested in or regard as more important than something else. And our editors are all the time juggling our professional sense of what's important, but always mindful of the audience.
Our thanks to Mary Hockaday, head of the BBC's Multimedia Newsroom. Now, also in the news this week has been the BBC itself, or rather its head. The new Director General, George Entwistle, took office, an open plan one apparently, on Monday. He's been asked by his boss, the Trust Chairman, Lord Patton, to make the BBC 10 to 20% better, with no more money, of course. Presumably that applies to feedback as well. How can it be done? Well, Mr. Entwistle wants to focus relentlessly on creativity and to create, and I quote, genuinely digital content, though he hasn't spelt out fully what that means. He also plans, like almost all incoming Directors General do, to restructure fundamentally the BBC over the next 2 years. That's what he's planning. But what would you like him to add to his list of priorities? Well, over the past weeks, we have been asking you to send us your letters to the DG, and we promised to bind them into a beautifully hand-stitched leather volume and present it personally to him. And here it is. Are you sitting comfortably, Mr. Entwistle? Then I'll begin. So, right at the beginning, on the top of the gilded page 1, we have a letter from Tony Frank.
Hello, George. Congratulations on your new job. I really wanted just to put in a serious request that you do something about the patent imbalance of reporting from, by, about women, because I get increasingly frustrated by the absence of female voices. It can't be news to you or to anybody that over 50% of us are women. When I heard you being interviewed by John Humphreys, that gnarled and grizzled veteran, I was surprised he was a gnarled and grizzled feminist as well. But it was good to know that you were challenged vigorously, and it seemed to me honestly.
And indeed, Mr. Entwistle, in that very interview, you promised John Humphreys that
whenever there's a possibility of putting a new female presenter in to do jobs in the news, we should look for it and take it if we can.
But with Robin Lustig retiring from the world tonight, I wonder which woman you might have in mind to fill his shoes. Now, more please to the new DG.
My name's Gordon Petherbridge. I'd like to ask the Director General whether he's happy with the current state of listener contacts with the BBC. I'm hoping that his arrival will produce a much better listener programme maker contact, which over the recent past has almost disappeared in actual fact. What he intends to do about it.
My name is John from Cheltenham, and my point to Mr. Entwistle is that there has been, over the years, and still is, a dearth of programmes about engineering. And as engineering was a vital part of our heritage, I think it's about time this activity was given more prominence.
I can hear the ghost of Fred Dibner cheering. Now, to turn to page 6 of our mighty tome, and to Fiona from Buckinghamshire.
I'd like to put it to the new Director General that I think there's a requirement perhaps for a new radio station. I'm one of the audience that the Radio 1 Director of Programmes wants to get rid of in his natural churn, but I don't really feel there's anywhere to go, and I want to hear engaging chat and I want contemporary music.
My name's Brian Agath, and I'm from mid-Wales. I'd like to put a question to George on what should happen about the TV licence. Personally, I listen to the Radio 4, and I do not have a TV licence. But the way things are going, more and more people are going to switch to iPads and other forms and also not have a licence. So he needs to look at radical forms of adapting to the new situation.
And so we skip to the final page of our bulging volume. And surely all good stories should have a happy ending. Michael Parks certainly thinks so.
I would like to suggest to Mr. Entwistle that he give some thought to at least partly redesigning Radio 4's schedule and programming to move to a better balance between bad news and good news. There is enormous merit in investigating good work and good relations between people and countries. It will enable us to go to bed not constantly feeling depressed and overwhelmed with sarcasm and cynicism, but excited, enthused and happy to wake up the following morning and listen to Radio 4.
Ah, if there were only good news. And that's the end of the feedback listener's contribution to the DG's in tray. For now. Thanks to all of you who have contributed, and let me reassure you that there is still room in the volume for more, so do keep your thoughts coming. We extend an open invitation to the Director General to come and talk about them on the programme, whenever he can make it. But the sooner, the better. We heard there from listener Tony Frank, who wants Mr. Entwistle to look at the role of women in the BBC, and in particular their visibility. And she's not the only one. Last Friday, the new Culture Secretary, Maria Miller, urged the corporation to stop burying women's sport. Deborah Hackett agrees.
The News this morning reported that our minister wants to see the media give women's sport equal coverage. Now, unless I slept through one of your bulletins this morning, I did not hear you mention that the Women's Golf Championships at Hoylake had been suspended yesterday. Please do better in future and include women's sporting news.
So does the corporation intend to listen to the concerns of Deborah Hackett? Richard Burgess, the head of Sports News, gave us this response.
We have limited time in our sports news bulletins on radio and television, and as such, it's not always possible to cover every sporting event or story. However, we're constantly assessing our editorial priorities, and currently we are continuing to look for opportunities to increase our coverage of women's sports. That's across all our output, on TV, radio and online.
Judging by Thursday's bulletin, they've been listening to the Minister, the DG and, of course, feedback listeners.
Just very briefly, Eniola, yesterday's game was live on BBC Radio and television. How much more needs to be done, do you think, to get the exposure that women's football needs?
Well, I think it's just about letting people know, when exactly the games are.
That was Chris Dennis talking on the Today programme on Thursday to footballer Eniola Aluko. Now, if you'd like... Well, I was about to explain how you can contact Feedback. But enough of Bolton. Here's Blackburn.
You can write to Feedback at PO Box 67234, London SE1P 4AX, or leave a phone message on 03333 444 544. Standard line charges apply, but it could cost more on some mobile networks. Or you can email feedback@bbc.co.uk. All those details are on our website. Is that all right?
Not bad, Tony, but don't go away. We're about to revisit your youth. Another slightly young man who has been muscling in on my job is our enthusiastic listener-cum-boy reporter, Ollie Dean. Last week, Ollie lent me a disturbingly capable hand when we tried to find out, from Radio 1's Director of Programmes, Rhys Hughes, what the new Radio 1 breakfast show will sound like when Nick Grimshaw takes over from Chris Moyles. This week, I've sent Ollie off on his own to visit the greats of breakfast shows past and see if he could gather some advice for young Mr. Grimshaw, who starts before dawn next Monday. Take it away, Ollie.
Good morning.
Hello. I listened to Chris Moyles since I was 8 years old. Now I'm 16. It's pretty much the only Radio 1 breakfast show I've ever known. So, to start my investigation, I have to tune back to 1967.
Now, with the clock ticking slowly up to 7 a.m.
And Radio 1's first ever breakfast show, the first programme on the network, presented by radio legend Tony Blackburn.
And good morning, everyone. Welcome to the exciting new sound of Radio 1.
As I remember, we didn't have too many features. We basically homed in on playing quite a lot of music. My whole aim was to entertain the family. Because in my own mind, first thing in the morning, first of all, you don't say anything that's offensive because there are a lot of kids listening. In the early days, I know Chris has probably done it slightly differently.
21 minutes past 7. You know that expression, the worst is yet to come? It's not true, I'm here.
And that was it, just doing what I'd always done on the Pirates. It did work very, very well. Not such an achievement as it would be now because, of course, there wasn't any commercial radio and there was no other pop music station.
So what was your audience? How many people were listening to you?
It ranged between 20, 21 million. Enormous, absolutely enormous audience.
It's mental. Absolutely mental.
Yeah,
21 million. You've worked on many different radio stations, many different shows over the years. How does a Radio 1 breakfast show compare to all of them, though?
It's the show that everybody, if they're really honest, would love to do. It's a special show. There aren't many of us who've done it over the years. The time for me, the years that I had the breakfast show, were the best.
Tony Blackburn. Have you entered a competition of this sort before?
Oh, no, never. I never dreamt I'd win.
Oh. Did you ever, at any stage in your life, think that perhaps your news were superior to anyone else's?
Radio 1. By the 90s, Radio 1 had started to lose sight of its younger listeners, and its status was far from cool. It was time for a big change.
It says we're on now till 9 o'clock, and then unfortunately it's Mayo, but until then, just make the best of it.
In April 1995, it was another Chris to be the network's saviour. The ginger one.
I haven't done this for a while.
Hello, my name's Dan McGrath. I was the producer, in inverted commas, of the Radio 1 Breakfast Show with Chris Evans.
Hang on a minute, John's just told me to stop it. What, the show?
Dan and the rest of the production team were on air as much as Chris, the so-called zoo format later embraced by Chris Moyles. I wanted to know what Chris Evans' breakfast show was doing so right.
I've stopped the show. I've stopped.
He was like a dog with a bone. If you went in and said anything off the air, you'd then hold your head in your hands and think, oh, wish I hadn't said that, because you knew 10 past 8, microphones faded up, big hour, everyone's listening, and you're like...
No. Anything you want to mention, Dan?
No, is there something I should be mentioning?
Yes, there is, Danny boy! Anything you want to tell us about before I tell the world about it?
Oh, dear.
It's not good, but then people are talking about it in the pub. Dare I say it, it was kind of pre-Big Brother. It was watching people have a good time, melt down, argue, and that's kind of what we were doing. We were making people go, I can't get out of the car. I sat in. I missed my train because of you idiots.
You should see the expression on his face.
I haven't got the faintest idea.
John, do you know what I'm talking about?
So it seems the soap opera format of the Chris Evans Show was massively popular with the listeners. Pushing the boundaries can be a good thing, but when does it go too far?
Hello, I'm Oliver. Hey, Oliver. Lovely to meet you. I'm Sarah.
Sarah Cox, or Coxie, as we like to know her, took over the breakfast show in 2000. I was starting to see a pattern emerging with the Radio 1 breakfast DJs, that a little bit of controversy can be no bad thing. I went to talk to her in her home in North London.
When I took over breakfast, it was very much the era of, I just hate saying this word, of the I can't say it. You've got to say it for me, Oliver. Do you know the word I mean?
The ladettes.
Yes, I hate that word. I think I was sort of seen as quite a raucous, feisty, controversial girl who'd be out boozing it up. I'd have died if I'd have been out every night. So there were a lot of nights where actually I was in bed at a decent time.
What was your record for little sleep before a show?
I do remember I missed the start of the show after the Brits once. There's no worse feeling as a broadcaster than being in a cab with your own show playing on the radio and you're in the back of a taxi hating yourself.
Missing the start of the show is one thing, but then I discovered that there had been times when things had gone too far. In 2002, Ali G, the comic creation of actor Sacha Baron Cohen, came onto the breakfast show in character and lived up to his rep for misbehaving.
Sacha Baron Cohen as Ali G spelt the word mother and then said the F word.
An M-O-T-H-E-R blank, blank, blank.
The thing is with live radio, the whole beauty of it is that magic can happen, but also things can go horribly wrong. Don't know, you lot cover your faces and not help me. What can we do? What can we do? I do apologise. It's live radio.
Do you think a presenter who is a bit controversial and who breaks the rules a little bit actually makes a really good Radio 1 breakfast DJ?
Look, I think so. I think I personally, as a listener, I do quite like that. Anything can happen. I think it's definitely nice to have that edgy quality to it, and I think especially on BBC Radio 1, we want to be aiming at young people and at people who've got a sense of humour, and I think it's quite a good quality to have, really.
Listener Emma Caution would like to know, with so many people listening, how do you get into the right mindset to guide them into the day ahead?
You know what, I used to wake up, Emma, and my alarm would go off, and the first split second I'd be like, oh. And then I'd remember what my job was, and the adrenaline would kick in immediately. And I wouldn't spring from the bed surrounded by bunnies and bluebirds, but you do find that once you're on there and you're playing the music and you're with your team, it's pretty easy to be cheerful, really.
Breakfast with Sarah Cox. That is going to tear down the world.
So tasty.
On Radio 1.
Advice for Grimmy.
Advice for Grimmy.
I can answer that. I'll try and answer that.
If he goes out, I'm going to be the annoying person telling him that he's got to go home and go to bed, I reckon.
Hold on to your inner nerd. I think you have to be a nerd to do a breakfast show. You look at all the great jocks. Edmonds and Kenny Everett and Chris Evans and Moyles, they're all nerds. They're nerds, and in a good way. They like the art of making radio.
With the breakfast presenter, you want to go down the pub and sit there with them in a nice warm beer garden and chat and have banter, and that's what they generally bring, I think.
Don't try and be cool and enjoy it.
Be bright and cheery and just be himself. And hopefully he'll do it well. I'm sure he will, And he's given the opportunity, and I'm sure he'll grab it because it's the best opportunity he'll ever have.
And finally, John, who's a feedback listener, asks, what happened to Arnold?
My dog Arnold, that I used to use for many years, he started with me out on the pirate radio ships, and then he came to me at Radio 1. He is no longer with us. It would be a miracle if he was, because he'd be 48 years old now. But what I did, I had him, when he passed away to that golden dog basket in the sky, I had him stuffed, and he now nods in the back of my car.
Tony, thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.
Our thanks to Tony Blackburn and to Sarah Cox, who now have breakfast in bed. But not together, of course. And to producer Dan McGrath. And, of course, to our teenage reporter Ollie himself. Well, he says he's a teenager, but listener Sean Rankin says he doesn't sound like one.
I would like this investigated. He sounded about 35 and used the term the youth of today.
Well, Ollie, as a youth of today, what have you got to say to that?
As honoured as I am 16. I recently did my GCSEs and have just started my A-levels.
Now, after our interview last week with the BBC's head of religion and ethics, in which Akhil Ahmed explained why it had been decided to keep Thought for the Day free from atheists and agnostics, we've had a biblical flood of correspondence. We plan to address this divisive issue again and more fully at a later date. But for now, here's just a flavour of some of the points you've been making.
Hello, I'm Alistair and I'm from West Yorkshire. I have to say I'm getting quite weary of the argument being put forward that Thought for the Day, and indeed anything with the religious content, is dominating our airwaves. I could argue equally that we endure a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week secular onslaught on most media. But there's a very high level of intolerance from the secular lobby that's developing, and that's almost as fundamental as those with faith are accused of being. And so I'm pleased that the editor of Thought for the Day is resisting the pressure to end this 5-minute slot.
Hello, my name is John Gillibrand and I live in West Wales. As an Anglican priest, I would say hands off Thought for the Day. It is often helpful and at its best inspirational. As a philosopher of religion, I believe that it is vitally important that philosophy should be allowed to shape our public discourse. So why not leave Thought for the Day as it is and have a separate item? It could be called Idea for the Day, in which philosophers are given space to do exactly what the theologians do on Thought for the Day, to comment on what is in the news. In our contemporary economic and political crisis, we need to listen to the very best thoughts and ideas, whatever their source.
Hi, I'm Sarah from Glasgow, and I just wanted to say that I was quite disappointed to hear about the decision not to include humanist views and atheist views within Thought for the Day. It's a show that I really enjoy listening to. It was just really sad for me because I know that I'll not have the opportunity to listen to a speaker who offers views that reflect my own.
My name is Frank Odds. I live just outside Aberdeen. The problem with Thought for the Day is simply that it is so incongruous. In the middle of a 3-hour programme in which every other guest is grilled thoroughly by the hosts, why don't we have a similar God slot in as many other programmes as possible? Woman's Hour could have a few daily words from a female priest. I'm sure Eddie Mair would enjoy a thought for the evening thrust into the middle of PM. Someone could perhaps say grace during the food programme, and if you can find a suitably witty cleric, they could be given a 60-second intervention in just a minute to present a religious theme without repetition, hesitation or deviation.
Do keep your ideas coming. And that's about all we have time for this week. But what's this? Outtakes from Ollie's interview with Tony Blackburn. The producer didn't want me to listen to this for some reason. Can't think why.
Is there anywhere you'd like to go next? Maybe feedback on Radio 4?
Well, feedback would be a terrific step for me, actually. Yeah, I do love feedback very much, and it needs a younger person on it. I mean, I'm only 70 in January, so I think I'm the next person on it, and it wouldn't surprise me to be getting the phone call very soon.
Tony, I was in short trousers when I first listened to you. Well, OK. Bell-bottom jeans, a flowery shirt, and a Zapata moustache. Goodbye.
Magazine that publishes it.
Hi, my name is Julia Radcliffe. The significance and seriousness of the mob violence aimed at the embassies across the Middle East was already established by the time the story broke about the royals' privacy being breached. Then Camp Bastion came under attack, and these stories, the embassies and Camp Bastion, impact on many thousands of people across the world and in the UK. The royal sunbathing story is important and is clearly topical in relation to the Leveson inquiry, but by comparison it directly affects or impacts on so few people. I would really appreciate knowing more about how these decisions are made as to how a story is prioritised.
Mary Hockaday is the head of the BBC's multimedia newsroom. I asked her whether the topless Duchess was really a story of major importance.
Well, I, first of all, wouldn't actually describe the story in that way. I'm not so much interested in her and her physique. What we were interested in was what the story told us about the media, and then, very, very importantly, what it told us about the royal family and William and Kate in particular, and how they are choosing to tackle this and respond to this. And they have responded in a very different way to some of the rest of the royal family. So that was the main reason that it was, in our view, an important story.
But what did it tell us about the press? There could be no doubt that if something like that occurs, some publication in Europe will publish the pictures. I mean, you're not astonished or surprised by that.
Women.
More of your messages for the DG later. Also in this week's programme, just some of the Noah's flood of correspondence we've had about whether Thought for the Day should be opened up to non-religious presenters.
There's a very high level of intolerance from the secular lobby that's developing that's almost as fundamental as those with faith are accused of being.
And we exclusively reveal what's happened to that much-loved canine of the airwaves, Tony Blackburn's faithful dog, Arnold. But first, what was the biggest, most important story on BBC Radio last Friday?
It's 8 o'clock on Friday the 14th of September. The headlines. A French magazine has published pictures of the Duchess of Cambridge sunbathing topless while on holiday.
The World at One. This is Sean Lay with 45 minutes.
This is a download from the BBC. To find out more and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk. Hello. What does the new Director General of the BBC really care about? His salary? His BBC pension pot? The prospect of a knighthood? Shame on you for being so cynical. It's not about him, it's about you. Oh, that's what he told John Humphreys on Wednesday's Today programme.
The audience, and in the end that's what I'm really interested in.
The audience? Well, George, if it's the audience you're interested in, we've got plenty of them lining up in this week's programme to tell you what they're interested in.
I really wanted just to put in a serious request that you do something about the patent imbalance of reporting from, by, about.
It's some news and comment. The publication of topless pictures of the Duchess
and Duchess of Cambridge are said to be furious. And
the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge have begun legal action.
The Duchess of Cambridge, topless.
And, of course, the topless story continued to top the bulletins over the weekend and into the following week. Many of you were far from impressed with BBC News' priorities.
My name is Andrew Anderson, and I want the BBC to report serious news. When its main report to millions of people is really tabloid tittle-tattle, it helps turn a minor subject into a major scandal. In making this the main, most vital subject in its news, the BBC shows itself as really no better than the